That is not on the table. You never know.
All right, that's why I say we plan. Oh, okay, wait. I don't want to.
Just gonna stay. We're good when you are, yeah.
Okay. Hi. I'm Natasha Turt. I'm the board chair of Wolf. Welcome to Gender Hurts, the Feminist Fight Against Gender, panel discussion with Sheila Jeffries, Chiara, Helena, and Jessie. Thank you all for coming today and for tuning in on the live stream. Leah Keith was planning to introduce this event today, and she's very sorry that she couldn't be here, as we all are. But she sent me the words that she was hoping to say so that I could share them with you anyhow. What she said. What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open, wrote poet Muriel Rukeyser in 1968. We are lucky to live in a time when woman after woman has told the truth. When propelled by collective pain and inchoate rage, women found the words, saw the pattern called politics, created theory, and built a movement to liberate women. And the world did split open. A short history of feminist accomplishments, rape crisis hotlines, battered women's shelters, abortion and birth control on demand, sexual harassment laws, equal funding for girls' sports, a storming of the barricades in the trades and professions, and a flowering of lesbian culture. We owe everything to these women. Where there is injustice, though, there is always resistance. But equally, resistance brings backlash, and we are now living in a time of vicious backlash. Both the left and the right have reaffirmed their bedrock belief in women's naturally subordinate nature. Whether we are seen as the private property of one man or the public property of all men, as Andrea Dworkin put it, either way, it is our nature to serve men, according to men. And hence, both left and right are champions of gender. We are now being told that if you don't like being subordinate, it's not because subordination is wrong, it's because you aren't a woman. Both left and right often act as if women aren't real human beings, but the cage around us is very real. It's heartbreaking beyond measure how much men love that cage. The only antidote I know for both that heartbreak and that cage was expressed by another poet, Ntozake Shange, when she wrote, "I found God in myself, and I loved her fiercely." To Sheila, the women of Wolf, the women around the world, say thank you. Thank you for telling the truth and splitting the world open. To Chiara, Helena, and Jessie, first we say we're sorry. What Ntozake Shange found should have been passed on like a sacrament from the women who came before. The cage is not you. It was never you. But the transmission got broken, and women, young women especially, are lost once again in that pain and inchoate rage. Some of us have been fighting for decades. We never gave up, but it wasn't enough, and we're sorry. And second, we say welcome. Welcome here with us. We are honored to have you all tell the truth about your lives, and we stand ready to split the world open with you. And now about our panelists. Dr. Sheila Jeffries has been involved in women's liberation since 1973 in the UK and later Australia. She's been involved in campaigns around violence against women, pornography, prostitution, and lesbian feminist politics in particular. She taught sexual politics at the University of Melbourne for 25 years and is now retired to the UK. She's the author of 10 books, including Gender Hurts, a feminist analysis of the politics of transgenderism. Her most recent book is The Lesbian Revolution, Lesbian Feminism in the UK from 1970 to 1990. Chiara identified as a trans man from approximately ages 16 to 19 before desisting. She is now focused on providing support for young people and spreading awareness about gender dysphoria as well as other reasons behind trans identification. She is also motivated to bring attention to the rising number of young people affected by rapid onset gender dysphoria and the risks of beginning medical transition. Jessie identified as a trans man from ages 15 to 19, briefly as non-binary at ages 15 and 19, and took testosterone from age 18 to 19 before detransitioning. During this time period, Jessie was a prominent figure in her local and online transgender activist circles. Since renouncing gender ideology, she is now an advocate for gender dysphoric, gender nonconforming, and LGBT youth. She aims to facilitate awareness of mental and environmental factors that contribute to the development and perpetuation of gender dysphoria, as well as the risks of medical transition and toxicity of gender ideology. Helena, 20, identified as transgender from ages 15 to 19, identifying first as non-binary and later as a trans man. Helena was very involved in trans activism both online and at school. She started testosterone at 18 and detransitioned 17 months later. After detransitioning and connecting with countless other assisted people, Helena realized the danger that gender identity ideology poses to today's youth. She is now invested in cultivating a sense of community for those who have detransitioned and being outspoken against gender identity ideology and legislation. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say how fantastic it is to be here. I don't usually get to talk about anything of this kind, anywhere actually. I kind of get pursued wherever I try to speak. But to be able to talk about this topic in New York is fantastic for me, and I'm very grateful to Wolf for organising it. And it's fantastic to be here with these three wonderful young feminists who are the future. And so that's a great pleasure for me. Now, I thought I'd just briefly, to introduce this, talk about what was happening in the 1970s. It's sometimes nice to set a context for this. In the 1970s, we didn't have this problem. In the 1980s, we didn't have this problem. There were about 2 male cross-dressers in Britain who tried to get into feminist events. 2. And women were fiercely in opposition. And Jan Raymond wrote her book, The Transsexual Empire, in 1979. We were already rejecting the idea of transgenderism in Britain and saying it's about gender, enforcing gender, and so on. So the politics were very strong, and there was nothing like the situation that we have now, which kind of proves, I think, and this is why history is useful, that the phenomenon we're dealing with is new. This is a new, socially constructed phenomenon. It's not the case that there have always been transgenders and there have always been numerous, and we've got this history of transgenders. It's simply not the case. So we need to understand, and I will say a few things this evening about why this phenomenon is happening now, what the historical forces were, the forces of power that constructed this situation that our sisters have suffered from, in fact. So, I'm going to just give a bit of background this evening. I'm going to talk about how the book came about and a bit of the effects of that. And I want to talk about how gender hurts different categories of persons. And then I will hand over to our feminist sisters to talk about their precise experience, because they are a group who has been hugely hurt by all of this. Now, the book, Gender Hurts, originally, I was looking for a publisher in 2007. I'd already written quite a lot about transgenderism, not only back in the 1970s when I said in the London Women's Liberation newsletter I didn't care whether they thought they were a Boeing 707 or a duck. They still shouldn't be in the Women's Centre. Those are my precise words. So that was not 1978. But after that, I wrote a chapter in Anti-Climax and in Unpacking Queer Politics and in The Lesbian Heresy and so on. So I've been writing about this issue for a very long time. I realized that I had to write Gender Hurts because in the 2000s, oh, and in Beauty and Misogyny too, another chapter. In the 2000s, it became clear to me that we had reached a critical pass. It was no longer the case at all that there were a few men that a lot of women had sympathy with who said that they had a mental health condition of gender dysphoria, which meant that they had to wear dresses and women's underwear in public places. It was no longer the case that that was, what was going on. It was clear that these men's interests and the demands being made by transgender activists were a movement which was actually opposed to women's rights of autonomy, women's rights to privacy, women's rights to call themselves women, women's rights to name parts of their bodies as they would wish. Completely, really, in opposition to all of those things that we've been striving for. I mean, in the 1970s, we said language was important. We said we are not ladies, we are women. We are not girls, we are women. We fought for our language, and now it is being taken away from us. So, in a way, I'm pleased that I didn't find a publisher in 2007, because that was too soon. It was not the right historical moment. So the fact that I had to wait is good, because 2014 was the right historical moment. Unfortunately, an awful lot had happened by then, but I think if it had been earlier, it wouldn't have been a rising tide that this book would have been able to chime in with. Particularly, I was concerned because I was watching what was happening in the UK from Australia, and in 2004, something called the Gender Recognition Act was passed. I didn't see it coming. I don't think feminists generally knew about it or saw it coming. Suddenly there was this piece of legislation. Feminists were never asked. They were never asked to put in submissions or say what they thought. Women were not asked. And yet the legislation was about men being able to say they were women. So it's an extraordinary situation in terms of any other form of oppression or any other oppressed group. They would be asked, I think, if members of the oppressed group wanted to be able to identify as them and be recognised by the state as them. Women, or whoever they were, would have been asked, but not women, because women are so unimportant that women were not asked before this legislation was passed. And the legislation said that there would be a gender recognition panel set up, and that men, and it was mostly men, would have to have evidence from doctors that they actually really had this thing called gender dysphoria. They didn't have to have any surgery, they didn't have to do anything special, but they had to come before the panel, and the panel had to recognise them as a woman. And of course, I've always thought that if I came before the panel, they probably wouldn't recognise me as a woman. I've never been very womanly, certainly not in the last 50 years. So, a gender recognition panel, gender is what feminism is determined to get rid of, because it's one of the main forces in the oppression of women, and the blooming government sets up a gender recognition panel under legislation they passed and didn't ask women about, that will actually look at men and say, he's doing it quite well, I think, bit of a swish, he is a woman. I mean, that's an extraordinary situation politically, and it wrote gender, this concept that comes from the oppression of women. Something happening here? Yeah, I'll go back. It wrote that into the law. I don't think we could ever have imagined the gender that we always thought. I'm coming in and out, I'm going in and out, never mind. I don't think we ever imagined that that could be written into law. And it was written into law in 2004. There was no protest even. Feminists wrote nothing about it. The only literature I found about it when I started to write about it was by postmodernists and people who were totally enthusiastic. They had a wonderful piece of legislation. No feminists were protesting. Nobody was saying anything. I don't think anybody saw it. I was looking at the House of Commons debates. They were absolutely, the House of Lords debates, absolutely extraordinary. They were, really fascinating. And the only people that I agreed with, actually, were conservatives. There were some of these lords saying, if there was a traffic accident, the medics will immediately know these were men, so what are you doing and what are you talking about? There was just really sensible things being said in the House of Lords, but it was pushed through by the Labour government at that time. So I thought, okay, this is a sorry pass. And gradually, these ideas of transgenderism were spreading out into the community. Insurance companies were considering it. Employers were putting in codes of practice, which was really about things like, even if a woman's been sitting next to Bobby for 40 years and knows exactly who he is, as soon as he says that he wants to be called Susan, he has to be called Susan, and so on. So those were the things that were coming out, sort of codes of practice, as well as, obviously, in some forms of legislation. So I thought, okay, I need to write about what's happening. And in 2014, I did Gender Hurts. And what I did there was I tried to look at where did all of these ideas come from, How are they in conflict with feminism? What constituencies do they actually hurt? And I called it gender hurts because it hurts many, many constituencies. That is the children who are transgender, the wives of the men who are transgender. Those who transgender themselves are hugely hurt. There's a medical experiment going on their health, which is tremendously harmful. So in the book, I thought I'd try and talk about all these different hurts, but based upon the idea that gender itself is immensely hurtful as a concept to women. But when transgender politics emerged, the hurt spread out and started to seriously harm many other constituencies of people. So first of all, I'll just say a little bit about where transgenderism came from. The ideology of transgenderism, of course, is that persons who transgender are essentially endowed with something called a gender identity, which consists of the mental and behavioural characteristics more suited to someone of the opposite sex. Persons who have this problem are diagnosed with having something called gender dysphoria, because their gender, whatever the hell that is, does not match their biological sex. I mean, does anybody here have a gender? I haven't. Anybody got one? What the hell is it? I mean, extraordinary. None of us know what it is, and none of us want it, but it's in law, and we're now under the rule of gender. It's an extraordinary situation. So, the problematic nature of the diagnosis of having gender dysphoria is clear in the fact that not everybody can get it. Heterosexual adult women don't get it. There's just one or two, but basically heterosexual adult women don't get it because you don't get support groups for men whose wives have transgendered, you don't get special small-size men's shoes or whatever it is, no special pornography, you don't get wives running up and downstairs in Y-front saying that their husbands need to have gay sex with them. It's not happening, right? So since it isn't happening, since everybody can't get gender dysphoria, we need to understand that it is actually, it's a problem that men constructed. The idea of gender dysphoria is something men constructed to cover their own particular concerns, and as I'll explain tonight, it was about men's sexual excitements, it was about men's rights. Men are sexually excited by the idea of having the identity of women. Now, the men who transgender are actually heterosexual men with a sexual fetish for women's clothes. The sexual fetish can take a variety of forms. What I'm saying here is not just my opinion. There's quite a large number of sexologists, one or two of whom were transgender themselves, who have written extensively about this, they're all men. And they came up with this term autogynephilia to explain why these men do cross-dressing. And autogynephilia means love of the woman in yourself. I don't know if it's a very good term, but it's the one that is commonly used. But autogynephilia takes various forms. One of the forms is simply being sexually excited by wearing women's underwear. Often the men who have this problem start wearing their sister's underwear or their mother's clothing at the age of about 11, at puberty, when they become sexually active with themselves, let's say. They start wearing these clothes. Some of them want to get sexually excited by doing what they think are the avocations of women, so they might do knitting. I know it's very difficult for women to understand why knitting is sexually exciting, but for the men who do it, it is sexually exciting. Some of them decide that they want to have artificial body parts of women, so they buy rubber suits, and so they're dressed up in rubber suits and they can stand in front of the mirror and fondle their breasts, which is very exciting to them. Some of them just have bits of body parts. They'll have a rubber vulva, which is very exciting for them, and so on. Some men go further than that, autogynephiles, and decide they actually want surgery to create imitation women's body parts. Of course, actually nothing like any women's body parts. But all of these different forms are sexually exciting to these men. Some of them, I'm sure, move on from one form to another and may have all of these forms together. But those are the basic interests that they have. Now, transgender ideology, it lies about gender, about what gender is, and says it's the same as sex. But in fact, as we know, sex is biological. There is no way you can change it. So it's absurd to suggest that you can. What's extraordinary is that so many in the medical profession, so many serious scientists are pretending that it's possible to change sex when everybody has known for a very long time now, ever since the Western scientific model emerged, I guess one could say, that you can't do that sex is actually something that is said. So it's an extraordinary time we're in, where all of this illusionism is taking place. Now, when men transgender, what they change is, of course, not their sex. It is their clothing, their hair, their makeup, sometimes the way they speak and sit. There's all of these training films and movies and things on the internet which can teach them how to sit like women, because women, as I am doing now, you know, you don't take up too much space, you put one leg over the other, but men do this. In fact,
together.
You're supposed to be together if you're a woman. And one of the ones I was looking at on the television, on the internet, did say that the man who'd done the training actually said, it's about power. Women don't have it, they put their knees together. Men do have it, they spread them apart. He knew. He was transgender and he knew. He knew at a time when the vast majority of women, and the vast majority of women still, think that these poor men have a mental health condition and we must be sympathetic to them and so on. At the same time, these men are writing online exactly what they know, which is it's about the eroticizing of power difference for sexual purposes. The wives complain about these men, that what they do is they seek to look like Barbie dolls, and they bedeck themselves in ways that the women in their lives themselves consider degrading. And over they say that. We'll say a little more about the wives and the terrible situation that wives are put in later on. The creation of the caricatures is the result of the fact that the men get their idea of womanhood from pornography, and so it's pornographic images they're trying to reproduce. The ideology of transgenderism says that the men who transgender have mysteriously acquired women's brains in biologically male bodies and possess a feminine essence. And men who transgender don't like critical analysis of where transgenderism comes from. They get furious with women like me who say we actually got to look at this. Historically, we've got to look at what constructs it, because they want to pretend there's some essence in there that fell from the skies as they were walking down the street one day, you know, as it can, of course. Now, the legislative and policy gains they've made, which endanger women's rights and threaten to disappear women as biologically female persons, are based upon the ideology. And to support the ideology, they argue there have always been transgenders in history, and they reject emphatically the idea of the social construction. Now, there is really very little, if hardly any, sociological or political analysis as to why the phenomenon of transgenderism has arisen. Remember, in the 70s and 80s it wasn't really there, barely at all. Or why it is burgeoning so much and so quickly. In fact, of course, transgenderism is socially and politically constructed, and the present contagion is the result of certain forces in a heteropatriarchal society. Transgender activists, for instance, that to try and prove that it's transhistorical will say, there have always been transgender children who were suffering in silence. Remember, at your school, there were all those transgender children in your class, real transgender children who just couldn't say anything because they were suffering in silence. Bullshit. Because, of course, they were not transgender children. The very idea that there can be is a social construction of the present. So let's have a little look at the social construction of transgenderism and when it took place. In the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s even, the sexologists, the scientists of sex, understood transgenderism to take two forms, transvestism or cross-dressing, which was occasional. Men would occasionally step out in their wife's knickers or whatever it was, and transsexualism, which was a more permanent kind of wearing women's clothes, but both of them were sexual. They understood entirely. It came under the heading of sexual perversion or a paraphilia, which is sexual. There was no suggestion of essence of anything at that time. It was understood by sexologists to be a sexual practice. By the 1990s, that had definitely changed, and it changed because of the introduction of the language of gender. What happened in the 1990s, let me just say what enabled the doctors to get into constructing transsexuals anyway. They needed certain medical specialisms to do so. They needed anesthesia, they needed hormones, and they needed cosmetic surgery. They developed all of that by the mid-century, which is how they were able to transgender men. But by the 1990s, things were changing. There were two forces that were involved in this change. One of these forces was the development of the internet. These men to come together in groups, provide resources, provide support for each other. All kinds of other groups were created at that time, which have some crossover. For instance, apatemnophilia, which is the desire of some men to have their legs amputated and their arms amputated for sexual excitement reasons. I mean, that's quite big, and some men who transgender cross over and have that as well. So they have two paraphilias. Some of them have other paraphilias that we might talk about later as well. But those two in particular, especially because, of course, the cutting off of the penis, I guess you could say, is, related to apatemnophilia anyway. But those two are quite close. So the internet spawned the possibility of men's sexual interest groups. And you'll probably be aware that women were not setting up groups around different paraphilias to do strange fetishist activities. The sexologists generally say that women don't have perversions, paraphilias, in the same way. In the 1990s, we know it had changed. The language of gender came in as a result of queer theory and postmodernism. The queer theorist Judith Butler, for instance, argued that it was extremely transgressive for people to wear the clothing of the opposite sex. So, particularly for men, I suppose, I don't think people notice really if lesbians wear trousers. But if you wear the clothing of the opposite sex, this is going to bring down patriarchy. People are going to have a revelation in the street, and they're going to think, golly, a woman in trousers, patriarchy gone, right? That seems to have been, the way that it worked. It was transgressive, very politically progressive if people ran about in the clothing of the opposite sex. In fact, not. But gender was seen to be, very politically dynamic and a vital political force in that way. Judith Butler was, she was not interested in form and structure and serious political movement and power structures and all of that sort of thing. It was a very strange and kind of superficial analysis. But the word gender really came in at that time, and the men's transgender movement that was forming on the internet picked up this language of gender because, transsexual's got sex in it. We don't want to think it's about sex. That's not really a good name. Transgender is good because it sounds as if it's about something innate, natural gender and so on. So they picked up the language of gender. By the mid-1990s, there was, in 1997, in fact, in the States, a transgender bill of rights that a cross-dresser and a transsexual put together. So they were really trying to create a political movement at that time. The previous movement of transgenders, of transvestites in the 1970s, and if you go to the public library in this city, the New York Public Library, where they're having the Stonewall Plus 50 exhibition at the moment, there are copies on the wall of a magazine called Transvestia, set up in the 1960s by a man called Virginia Prince. He was really a sort of pioneer of the transgender movement. In fact, he actually started using the term transgender, although it didn't really catch on at that time. But his magazine is there. They are very fascinating, the copies of them. But there wasn't really a movement at that time. Virginia Prince himself did not have his penis off. He said he was a cross-dresser, he was definitely not a transsexual, and he said he couldn't understand anybody would have the penis off. And of course now the vast majority of those called transgenders don't have their penises off. There's not much point putting on your wife's underwear for a bit of sexual excitement if you've already had the penis off, because, it kind of acts against you. Do you see what I mean? There are limitations to the surgery, and so a lot of men, the vast majority, do not do that anymore. So the cross-dressers movement, starting in the 1990s, was a very important force in the coming out of transgenderism, the construction of it into a significant practice. Pornography was another very important force. A couple of years ago, when I was writing about this, for Helen's book, I I found the estimate that 10% of the pornography industry was transgender. Now that's huge. If you would consider that 10% of men were transgender, we'd have even more of a problem than we could have at the moment. But what we do know is that huge numbers of men are sexually excited by transgender pornography who will never go on to do anything about it. Like huge numbers of men who are excited by paedophile pornography are not actually going to go on and sexually abuse children. So the ultimate forms of these practices don't necessarily happen. But if you look at the transgender pornography, it's very, very, very useful, illustrative of what transgenderism is about. If anybody is having problems coming to terms with the fact that for heterosexual men, it's about sexual excitement, very important to look at this pornography. And in the pornography, the men seek to be usually forcefully transformed into women. It's called feminization, sissification, bimbofication, and so on. They get transformed into women, and that's the sort of money shot is the moment at which usually a woman in a lot of pornography puts lipstick on them or in some way reduces them to what they see as the degraded status of women. The women's clothing is satisfying to masochists because they're excited by the degraded status of women. So this pornography is, as I say, pretty clear. In the pornography, men have injections, or they take a pill, or they get forced somehow to become women, which is the lowest of the low. It would be a horrible thing, ejaculation. Now, my favourite title, which I always mention from looking at this pornography, I only looked at the written pornography on Amazon. There was no way I was game to look at the videos. I wasn't. The title I like best is Gender Swapped by Aliens. And you think to yourself, how extraordinary that all these men, huge numbers, are looking at this stuff. You know, somebody in your office, in your home, in your bed, looking at this stuff, gender swapped by aliens. You know, women are serious in the world in comparison with this. There are many varieties of the transgender pornography. For instance, there's pregnancy transgender pornography where men pretend to be pregnant. There's lactation pornography when they're into trying to lactate themselves by the use of drugs or sucking milk from somebody else's breast. There's pornography in which clearly ladyboys from Thailand who've been trafficked probably and put on these drugs are having to lactate for other men's sexual excitement. And there's cross-age transgender pornography when men are transformed into 5-year-old girls and so on. Interestingly, on the covers of all of these books I found on Amazon, it was actual women and girls in the pictures. So these men are ambitious because there's no way they're going to look like 5-year-old girls or whatever, right? So it's always women. But what it does show us is where the huge surge in transgenderism is coming from. The men are reading this stuff, they're getting very excited, they want to go out and be able to be in the women's toilets and wearing this kind of clothing, and so on. Now, I'm trying to rush ahead because I do want to get on to the most important part of this evening. What are you doing? It's the middle of the day. So what I will do is look at some of the ways in which the transgender movement and the transgender politics that have developed this, what I call this men's sexual rights movement, because it is about their sexual rights to dress as women in the spaces of women. And you know, one interesting example of this was a man who, in the women's toilets, would go up dressed as a woman to women and ask to shake their hands. Of course, women didn't want to shake his hand, but that would have been the money shot. A woman recognises him as a woman in women's clothing, in the women's toilet, shakes his hand, wow, right? So the problem with the transgender movement now is the fetishes of these men are coming out into public space. They're not staying behind their computers and looking at this pornography and having excitement. They are feeling that they have the right to come out into women's spaces, into the world, and make women the enforced audience or participators in the fetishes that they're involved in, right? So that's a new development and a very serious development indeed. So how does gender hurt? Gender, of course, hurts the men and women who transgender themselves because they are a scientific experiment in which very serious drugs are being used upon them. as I said in Gender Hurts, HRT, hormone replacement therapy, which is the same thing, but giving those drugs that normally women would have to women, it was found that there were very serious health effects from that. And so a lot of women, I think at least half, stopped using HRT because it wasn't necessary, obviously. But the drug companies suffered a serious loss from that. And they now have a new market, which is that they are able to get persons who wish to transgender onto pretty much the same drugs. The men are taking the same drug. No idea what is the safe limit, no idea whatsoever, because it's completely experimental and these drugs are not safe. So there are harms from the surgery, there are harms from the drugs, there are harms from the social isolation, the difficulty having relationships, the effects on the ability to be sexual. There are huge harms on the men and women who go through this harmful practice. And we're only going to realise the seriousness of the harm sometime down the track when we're looking at how long they live and so on. There is the constituency of wives and partners of men who transgender, and nobody was looking at the wives and partners. There was no research. There is no research. Nobody is looking at what happens to these women. All of the writings about the wives and partners were totally celebratory. Wives might go to a psychologist or to a doctor and say, I'm finding this quite difficult, that George is wearing my underwear and prancing about and saying I must be a lesbian and he's a lesbian, etc., etc., etc. And they would be told they must support the adventure, the journey their husband is going on. All of the literature I read said that. Right? Didn't matter whether it was from feminist psychologists or who it was from. They all said it was a privilege for these wives to be able to support this journey. What it actually meant was thousands and thousands and thousands of women were very silently, because it's very shameful to have to talk about this and say what George is doing. Who are you going to tell? It meant that thousands of women were suffering and suffering and suffering in silence. And very frequently the man would do a reveal. That's how he'd come out to his wife. He's been married to her 40 years, and he decides at some point that he's going to come out to her. So he will come down the stage, say, Doreen, I've got something I really need to say to you this evening. Sit in the lounge room and I'll come and say it. And then he'll flounce down. These are the stories I've actually read online of what happens to women. He'll flounce down the stairs in one of her dresses or some extraordinary dress that he has bought. They spend huge amounts of money from the family coffers on the fetish clothing that they buy. He'll flounce down the stairs and say, I am really a woman. Now you can imagine the enthusiasm with which the wife greets this information. For 40 years she's had his penis in her body, she's had 3 children by him, she damn well knows he is not a woman. But she's then under huge pressure, if not threat, and I'm sure in some cases it is, to call him a woman, to call him by his new name, to sexually service him, pretending to be a lesbian. I mean, she can't say to him, I'm not a lesbian. He wouldn't buy that. She's under huge pressure. And the pressure in these marriages is huge. So these women need all of our support, and some of them are coming out and they are speaking, but they are a seriously harmed category. Also mothers, the mothers of these persons, and the children of them. The children also suffer considerably from this extraordinarily selfish behaviour by men who are certainly not women and don't have any essence, it's fair to say. Another group which is immensely harmed, and we don't have time to look at in sufficient detail this evening, is the issue of children who are being transgendered. Now, the adult males who transgender, in order to prove it wasn't anything about sex, which it is, decided they had to transgender the children. They created this movement to transgender children. Because if children are essentially of the opposite gender, possibly at 18 months, in one of the books I was reading, you could tell at 18 months because a little boy wanted robins on his underpants and really he should have battleships. Therefore, we know that he's really the wrong gender. And honestly, that's how it is written. But the men thought that if they can somehow prove that children can get the wrong gender, it can't be about sex, because the 18-month-old boy in the knickers, not about sex, right? So the whole movement of transgendering children, these organisations train the National Health Service, they train doctors, and these organisations of adult men constructing the problem and training the medical profession to deal with it in the way that they would wish. The situation in Britain at the moment is that in the last 3 years there has been a 20-fold increase in the number of children being taken, usually by their parents, of course, because the parents are groomed as well to accept the behaviour. Sorry? So through the Tavistock Clinic in London, there's been a 20-fold increase. The vast majority of them now, 70% of them, are girls. It used to be the other way around. It was mostly boys. Now it is mostly girls. And these girls are, according to the research, the vast majority of them, in one piece of research, 95%, were same-sex attracted. Right? So you can see the constituency of persons who are undergoing this conversion therapy here, not only conversion of gender, but sexual conversions therapy, so that eventually they will be hormonally and surgically constructed heterosexuals. They're constructing heterosexual nuclear families amongst lesbian couples in this way. But there are many, many other harms. The way that transgender politics are developing at the moment, there are immense harms to the possibility of women's safety, dignity, privacy, by the entry of these men with sexual fetishes to women's toilets, changing rooms, shelters, and so on. And some of you may be aware that sadly, Vancouver Rape Relief, a wonderful organisation that serves women who've suffered domestic violence and sexual assault in Vancouver, who in the 1990s won an extraordinarily important court case because they would not allow a man who'd transgendered to be a counsellor in their centre. And they won in court, and it was said that women needed men, didn't need men, they needed women to counsel them at a rape crisis centre. They won that victory. It was extraordinary. Transsexual activists hated it. Yesterday, I think it was, they got to the funders in the city government, and the city of Vancouver, the state of British Columbia, has now said that unless they change their policies about the admission of men who are transgender, they cannot be allowed funding. Now, this is a hugely important organisation for feminists, hugely important. So these activists are tracking down and attacking in every way. Court cases, trying to get the funders, trying to make sure that women simply cannot have safe, dignified situations to be in. And of course, as you know already, there's been a kickback from this in the women's prisons. There's been rapes by a man who was put in a women's prison, or sexual assault at least. And in Britain, because they're so concerned about the fact that these men, 50% of the men who transgender in British prisons, who are transgender in Britain and are put in the women's prisons, are sexual offenders. Right? So these are very dangerous men. The government has slightly come to its sense and is now going to put a prison specifically for the men who say that they're women, but in a women's prison. In the middle of it, they're going to have a little separate prison. They can't quite get away from, they can't say they're not really women. That would be too dangerous. And the European Human Rights Act would probably have something to say about that, because, you know, this is enforced. This stuff is enforced. But there's beginning to be a little bit of a climb down in places about what's happening. I mean, in Wales, for instance, because of the degendering of toilets in schools, we've got school refusing on the part of girls, particularly girls who are starting to have their periods, who do not feel able to be in front of the boys who constantly make fun of girls, particularly for having periods. They do not feel able to attend school. So, but gradually, I think there's a little bit of sense is being come to in that country. Probably not got as bad here. Not got as bad here? No? Not quite in that situation. Okay. Sports is another area that all of you will be aware of that has been very, very important to women, very important to lesbians as well. The men are coming into the sports, and yes, and you will see a podium with man 1 and 2, woman 3rd, and she's half the size. So that's all going on, and at the moment, only very brave women like Martina Navratilova and others are standing out and saying what's wrong with it. Okay, there are huge, yes indeed, cheers. There are huge quantity of harms coming from this movement, more than we could ever have imagined, and I certainly couldn't imagine it. And the one thing that's really changed since the book came out is because there's opposition now in Britain, it's huge opposition. The transgender activists finding it very, very important to set the police on us. So there's been half a dozen cases when feminists and also some men as well have had visits by the police to threaten them basically and say they mustn't use hate speech which says that a man can't be a woman, One woman was kept in a police station for 7 hours away from her children. So they're setting the law around us. When have women or feminists ever been in a position, how do we even get help if we're assaulted, harassed, etc.? Of course we can't. And this is just about saying that men are actually men. It's not a big deal. Okay, I'm going to stop now, but as I say, there's a huge variety of harms. And we hand over to the next generation and these women to explain to you how they've been harmed by this phenomenon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So my name is Chiara, myself as well as Jesse and Helena, and the fourth member, Dagny, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, all created this called the Pique Resilience Project. Y'all may have heard of it. Essentially, our aim is to bring awareness to detransition and desistance, and basically provide support for other young people, specifically young women, who may be questioning their gender identity or even questioning their detransition. So we want to thank Wolf, thank Ms. Sheila Jeffries, everyone who has made it possible for us to be here today. We're very, very excited. And we also very much appreciate your support in terms of our project, and we are very excited for the future. So again, yes, my name is Chiara. I am 21, I'm a desisted woman. So essentially, from ages 16 to 19, approximately, I identified as a trans man. I did want to pursue hormonal therapy. The only reason I didn't is that my mother at the time wasn't supportive. Of course, now I'm very grateful for that. At the time, part of the reason it was very hurtful to me is that it did destroy my relationship with my mother and a couple other members of my family, which I do resent, for sure. So it was sort of kicked off. I was always very socially isolated in high school. I would say around the end of my sophomore year, beginning of junior year, I lost my entire friend circle just as a result of some, teenager things. And I turned to the internet, specifically Tumblr and YouTube, in an effort to just find people to relate to communicate with. And around that time was just when the trans movement online was first starting to really take hold. And of course, as I'm a gay woman, I definitely am still working to accept that. I was definitely not in a position to accept that at the age of 15 or 16. So it was very easy for me to adopt this trans identity because I think a lot of it for me was a reaction to internalized homophobia. It was an opportunity for me to escape being a gay woman and instead be a straight man. So that was very, very tempting for me. I very quickly developed this intense gender and sex and body dysphoria. You may have heard of the 2018 study on rapid onset gender dysphoria by Lisa Littman. That explains my experience, and I think some of ours as well, to a T. It came on very suddenly. I didn't really have gender dysphoria as a child. Around puberty and due to being socially isolated, I did latch onto this identity. And yeah, that persisted for about 2.5 years. The thing that allowed me to begin moving away from that is I did spend about 9 months in a different state on a horse farm with yeah, that's the answer. Go to a horse farm. So essentially, I had very little internet access. I was working, 6 days a week, 14-hour days. I was forced to be very physical with my body. I was essentially just cut off from the internet. I wasn't able to spend all my time there. I had to actually focus on things that were going on in my life. So yeah, I was there for about 9 months. I would say it basically, it just shifted my focus. It allowed me to actually begin to progress forward with my life. It was a very stagnant period when I was trans-identified. All I thought about was when can I get hormones, my future. I didn't think of my future as anything but being a man. That was all that took up my energy. So I think by the time I arrived back home after this stint at the horse farm, I matured a lot emotionally, physically, and mentally. And by the time I got back, I was in a better position to think critically about the movement. I began to find some radical feminist blogs. A lot of that appealed to me. A lot of those tenets of that feminism. And that just allowed me to begin accepting myself and realizing that, it's okay to be a gay woman. You don't have to, change your body and take hormones and surgeries just to be happy with yourself, And I began to accept myself more, which is still something I struggle with, but, I am getting there. So my goal really is to reach other young women and, in the hopes that they don't have to go through I think, what we've gone through at this time. So that's my main goal, and the goal for the future.
Hi there, everyone. I want to thank everyone for your support and for being here. I want to thank Sheila and Wolf and all the amazing women who have brought us together for the project, as well as brought us to all these incredible events. It's been really healing, and I'm very appreciative of being here. Again, my name is Jessie. I'm 20 years old. I identified as a trans man from age 15 to age 19, and the development of that identity was very sudden. I was an internet kid. As you can imagine, a lot of the young women here were as well. I feel like every young person who was born in the late 90s, early 2000s just grew up having a computer, having access to other people online, just being mesmerized by all the new information that you get, all the new people you can connect with, and that at an early age incited my passion for activism. Just as a Black person, I was always very interested in history, very interested in civil rights, very interested in feminism at a really early age. I have a very incredible grandmother who taught me many feminist values growing up. So it was interesting when I started to use Tumblr as like a primary social media source. I don't know how familiar you all are with Tumblr, but probably a little bit at this point. And in around like 2011, 2012, a lot of what young women were discussing were the very basic principles of what I consider a third wave feminism, like very liberal ideas of equality, a lot of men-focused ideas in feminism, which was not exactly progressive, and it didn't address a lot of the issues that women like myself were dealing with. Around that time, I was about 13, 14, was experiencing a lot of homophobic bullying in my middle school. I grew up in a really conservative neighborhood in Farm, Ohio, so you can imagine how that goes. So with the bullying, with feeling really alienated from my peers, as well as just not having any real sense of connection to the real world around me, eventually led to just a sense of distress and discomfort with what I had idealized womanhood to be. So that essentially led to my introduction into the world of gender identity, which is something I had never really thought of prior to having those ideas introduced to me by my peers. I contribute social contagion to the development of my gender identity and the persistence of my dysphoria over years. I experienced some sexual trauma as a young child, and early exposure to pornography against my will also contributed to a really distorted sense of self. So I had a lot of distress about the female body, about my own body, as well as in puberty, just the concept of having a relationship with someone in the future, like what that would look like, especially with sexuality concerns. So I really desperately wanted some escape, like some way out of identifying as female, or just not being able to see myself as female, essentially. So around age 15, I moved to a new school, neighborhood, a bit more liberal. And in that new high school, a lot of my peers were trans-identified, ironically, especially the peers in my creative fields. I was a music kid. I did a lot of band, choir, art classes, that kind of thing. And my peer group, they grew up watching a lot of anime. I don't know if you guys have read this report, but there's a very interesting article by Ray Blanchard, I believe. He shared it. Well, he shared it. He's great. But he thinks it's a good article. Anyway, about how media such as anime can relate to pornography, as well as just this weird development of how people perceive sexuality in each other. So I think being exposed to media like that so early, paired with my peers who were discovering things like non-binary identities, like they're calling this like agender, I use they, them pronouns, made me start questioning myself, because I was also extremely uncomfortable, extremely alienated, didn't feel like I fit in. And then I actually had a very close relationship with a trans man. So another young person who identified as a man but was biologically female and was actually one of the youngest people in the state of Ohio to be allowed to medically transition as a minor, so had a lot of influence in the local LGBT community. We had a very close relationship, and through me knowing this person, I was introduced to a lot of LGBT, but emphasis on the T, youth groups where I've had a lot of immediate affirmation for my very sudden dysphoria from people who were essentially supposed to be support systems to help me figure things out. Instead began suggesting to me new medicalization pathways I never even considered yet. I was just like, I don't like being a girl, so what else is there? So I got introduced very early, around age 16, to this idea of, well, if I'm uncomfortable with my body, I can start going on hormones. I can think about top surgery in the future, which is essentially just the double mastectomy, or bottom surgery, which would be hysterectomies, phalloplasties, those kinds of really invasive, intensive, and unhelpful medical procedures. So I started to bring the idea up to my parents, obviously not supportive, didn't think that was the right path for me, thought that it was very sudden that I was even thinking along these lines, feeling this way. But since my peers were the ones who were supportive, they used my pronouns, they used my new name, I felt such a sense of camaraderie and respect from them that I began to distance myself further and further from the people who knew me most intimately and cared the most about me, which would have been my family, the people who have been around me the longest and also my longest, closest friends. I gradually began to distance myself from them and then dive deeper into trans ideology because it was introduced in this is the meaning of life. This is how I get out of this really toxic headspace that I find myself in. So that progressed. I realized that I would have to wait until age 18 when I was considered legally an adult to be able to have access to hormones. Maybe about 3 days after my 18th birthday, I had already been living on my own in college. I decided to just make a trek to the nearest informed consent clinic, which at the time was about 6 hours away from me. And within a very brief appointment, I was able to get my testosterone prescription. And my healthcare, I firmly believe, wasn't handled as seriously as it should have. Granted, my trauma history, my mental health history, and the fact that I did not have familial support, nor a support system outside of other trans-identified youth. So I ended up being on testosterone for about 14 months. I began my detransition in March of last year, so it's been about a year of detransitioning. And what eventually led to the decision to detransition and the decision to renounce gender ideology completely was being introduced again to feminism, but this time radical feminism, and this time actually digging into good literature, actually digging into incredible conversations, listening to women speak, watching hundreds of videos online. It was very healing, and it felt like I had a sense of reality again. I think the most chronic feeling I had in my trans identity was similar to what Chiara said, feeling very stagnant, feeling like I was regressing, feeling like I wasn't going anywhere. I lost a lot of passion. I didn't have goals anymore, and my entire life became just a giant panic attack where I was always thinking about, am I passing? Or do people see me as male? Am I going to be seen as a male in my desk job in the next 10 years? Just things that I shouldn't have been focusing on. So now I'm here, very grateful for that, very grateful for all of this support, these experiences, and just being able to talk about this. And I feel like it's really important to expose the extreme toxicity of what the transgender community, especially online, can be, and how that affects young people, especially since we grew up with such a mentality where we are tuned into each other online, always thinking about everyone's thoughts. I mean, Twitter is essentially just a void where everyone shouts their thoughts, and some people's thoughts get seen as really important. It's these narcissistic men, usually, who champion the transgender movement. But again, very grateful to be here, and that's my little blurb.
Hi everybody, my name is Helena. I'm 20 years old and
wanted to say that it means a lot to see so many people out there, and it still consistently blows my mind as someone who was a very hardcore trans activist for 5 years, that I spent months after detransitioning alone and being rejected by the community that I once thought was so close to me, and that I would, a year from then, end up sitting in a room full of TERFs that are actually supporting me, like these diverse women who actually care and they want to make a difference for people like me. They're not just going to drop me based on my life choices or what I end up believing. So it means a lot that there's all of you guys out there. So this trans ideology, as you can probably, as you all probably agree from your own experiences and from what these three women have said, is just horrible for young people today. I guess I'll just tell my story of how I got involved with it, because I'm definitely very healed at this point, but it has been a very, very difficult journey for me. After leaving that ideology and detransitioning physically, I was on hormones for about 17 months. So growing up, I don't think I could call myself a tomboy, really, but I did have a lot of male friends. Just for some reason, at my school at the time, it was mostly my male friends who were loud and rambunctious and wanted to get dirty and wanted to tell crude jokes and just be ridiculous, as I kind of was back then. And I didn't really think about it. I didn't think of myself as, I'm a girl and they're a boy, and I'm supposed to look this way and they're supposed to look that way. I didn't really think about it. But as puberty rolled around, everyone started thinking about relationships and sexuality, and, you know, you're supposed to be pretty, or you're supposed to be masculine, you're supposed to do sports, or you're supposed to do makeup, stuff like that. And I just started feeling incredibly alienated from my entire community at school. And slowly I just began losing my friends, and similarly to how Chiara said, I entered this point in my life where I was very isolated, and I didn't have any friends really in the real world, and so I turned online. And when I did find Tumblr specifically, I used Tumblr a lot, more than anything else. I was super involved in the kind of social community on Tumblr. I think there's a difference between just using a website here and there and like making that website your entire world. And that's kind of what I did. So when I found Tumblr, at first it was just like different kinds of interests that I liked. I was really into classic rock and old music and Harry Potter and stuff like that. So I really liked that I could go on there and I could talk about that as much as I wanted, and no one would tell me to be quiet. People would be interested in what I had to say. They would laugh at my jokes. And it was really great during that period of my life. But as I started using Tumblr more, I started noticing that people were very into like social justice activism. And I always grew up in a very political family, so I always found what was going on in the world to be very important to me. My parents would always talk about it. And I started at first seeing just very basic feminist things. I remember school dress codes were something that was talked about a lot, and at that point in my life I went to a Catholic school and I hated my uniform. I didn't like wearing the stupid skirt. I didn't understand why I couldn't just wear pants. It was so dumb. So that was really important to me, and I started getting more and more into this activism stuff. And then for some reason, online nowadays, in the young people circles, stuff like feminism, like girls shouldn't have to wear skirts to school every day, is automatically lumped in with this super fringe gender ideology. So I just started seeing that more and more, and they would be like, well, you can't be a feminist if you don't support trans women, or, you know, stop saying that school dress codes are an issue for girls. Trans men are even more uncomfortable wearing skirts than cis girls are at school. Stuff like that, and I was like, oh my god. To 14, 15-year-old me, this seemed like, holy shit, why have people been keeping this from me all these years? This is the truth. Like, oh yeah, because I wasn't stupid. I was looking around at the girls in my school, and some of them seemed very happy wearing their skirts. I'm sure maybe they weren't, but to my perception, they seemed like they were very happy wearing their skirts. They liked getting their uniforms tailored, looking pretty, wearing makeup, and I just could not keep up with it. I would devote so much time and energy. I hated myself so much, And I could never be like that. So I thought, well, there must be something that separates me from those girls. And it's the fact that I'm not a girl. So that made a lot of sense to me at that point in time. And that's really all it took. All it took was that little seed of grossly misunderstood feelings that I was having to eventually make me go down a pathway that ended up with me being one of those college students who, you know, tries to get professors fired for not using they pronouns and taking testosterone. So, I don't know, it's really important that we're out here today and getting a conversation started in the States, because women's rights are obviously under fire, but what is happening to teenagers and children right now is absolutely disgusting, and it needs to stop. And thank you so much. Yeah, I think that covers what I was gonna say. I think now we're gonna open it up to questions or something.
So, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I want to say briefly, we are organizing here in the New York City area, and if you live in this area, talk to me. We have a secret Facebook group, and we have a Red Femme meetup group. And I do think it's important to meet in person and not only talk to each other on Facebook or whatever. And one of the things that I wanted to see in New York is a support group for detransitioners. I just assume this is a big city. There must be young women and young men detransitioning, but I'm not a detransitioner, so I don't know how I could be the one to do that. And I don't know what, I'm not sure what to, like, how can we see that happen? How, to have like local, and not just New York, but any large city, it seems like there should be people should meet in person and give each other support for detransitioning.
So the question was about how people should get started setting up support groups for detransitioners here in New York City or elsewhere because of the importance of meeting in person.
This is actually something that this is actually something that I've been really passionate about, just trying to get detransitioners more involved with each other, because it's incredibly lonely out there if you have no idea that hundreds of other people are going through the exact same thing. And it has been a struggle, because I live in Chicago, which is, like people say, it's, you know, New York light. So it's similar, it's a big city, it's got a lot of people, and it's also very liberal, like New York is. And I really have not, I've tried creating a Facebook group for like rad femmes / detransitioners. I've tried looking online, asking questions online, posting on detransition communities online, being like, is anyone from Chicago? We need to get something started. And it's just so hard to find other people. Maybe they're just not vocal. Maybe they feel too much shame to want to connect with other people at that point in their lives. So I do think that for right now, a lot of our efforts have to continue to be online. And we have to put a lot of effort into helping people open up and know that there is a community in general out there across the entire globe. And then once I think we can get people talking more online, I think it will be a lot easier to start creating real life support groups for detransitioned people. But I'm going to continue trying to get something started in Chicago, and I'd love to get in touch with people in New York if we can get something started, because maybe it's a different atmosphere over here. But yeah, it has been difficult, but we just need to keep helping people, changing the narrative to let people know that they aren't alone, and that if they want the support group, that there are people out there who will want one as well.
So the big issue I think for me is that I was never indoctrinated into gender ideology. I was always kind of like a man in a dress is not important. I mean, it was a big thing that started happening around like 2012 in Tumblr, 2011. That's when we started seeing like this big kind of like discourse wars. But I eventually started to experience gender dysphoria or body dysphoria, and a very interesting, very strong transitioner. Her name is Carrie. And I saw this video about the pain of girlhood, right? So like similar to your name's Jessie, I was exposed to pornography unwillingly at a young age and all this stuff, and this had latent effects on my development. So going into my question, that's both for the transitioners here and for Sheila, which I'm a big fan, and thank you for coming. How do you deal with, like, because there's the information, right, and you know the truth, right, but there's what to do with the truth and how to just be still with what remains. So, like, as I'm going, because I came also late into my lesbianism, because I also went to Catholic school for 12 years. I grew up in a very religious household. Was very much in denial about being a lesbian. I actually didn't come out as a lesbian probably until 4 years ago. So it's really what advice you give to women who like might be exposed to the information, but aren't there yet. It's incremental, and every day you have to make a recommitment to yourself to accept the reality of being gender non-conforming. Even though I do accept that gender is a social construct, it still has real effects in your life. So when I come out and I purposely appear as quote-unquote italicized masculine, I experience violence from men and women on a more psychological level, right? And I do think online communities are important, but I've been online for 8 years now, and I'm going to get to Gio's question in a minute. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. I'm very dissatisfied in terms of where I've seen a lot of the radical feminist movement going personally, and I think there's a conversation at the end of this. So that, and also for Ms. Jeffries, my question to you is like, what advice do you give young radical feminists? Because we're at this point where, you know, a lot of young radical feminists, because of our upbringing with the internet and that immediate gratification, there's a fear of not being liked, and then there's a real fear of being doxxed and ostracized. But I don't think we can get to where because I think like a lot of what's happening politically or even socially has to do with the fact that we've been silenced and terrified, and it's just going to get worse, and has been getting worse, and the conversations are not there as to what are the concrete steps that we do next. I do think there's a power in organizing, I do think there's a power in going to like these political spaces, but like, what would you give words with me?
So the question is about how to deal with being dysphoric because of being a gender non-conforming person, a lesbian. The questioner has been a secret radical feminist for 8 years and is asking the panel about how to address the concerns about being disliked, possibly being doxxed or otherwise harassed, and how to encourage people to step forward and carry the movement forward.
Yes, and also what's like concrete steps do you think? Like, cause like, you know, Sheila she understands the history of this in the grand scheme, like at where we are right now, what incremental like moves do we need to make to like undo the damage? Like just concretely, like, you know, anything, cause like I'm tired, I'm frustrated, I'm scared, like I'm absolutely terrified for young lesbians, especially Black lesbians, because we are constantly told our bodies are not feminine, that we are masculine by the virtue of our skin. I mean, like, this is like, if I did not find like one particular post at one particular time, I would have transitioned, I would have been a trans man, and honestly, with the linking of the BDSM community and pornography and kink culture and how it encourages female people to be masochists, like, I would have been so far gone. And I know there are women like me who just weren't as fortunate, you know, so what can we do? Like, because, like, I'm just kind of tired of this, like, being in the skirts, the outskirts, and then, like, oh, we all know we're keying on Discord and on Tumblr, and we can't even, like, talk same common sense. Like, it's crazy, it's maddening, like, and it kind of puts you in this point where, like, I know a lot of, I'm sorry, not blowing off, but, like, I know a lot of, like, rat femme identified trans men. Like, this is, like, a serious issue. Like, who are trans men, but they are in radical feminist spaces. They know the information, but they are so trapped because there is no alternative. So that's my concern, and my fear for myself is that I've been doing this for a long time, and I have my own personal issues with, like, inter-community issues, right? Like, what would happen to me? Do you get what I'm saying? Like, because the gender movement, they are out there in public. They have those spaces, you know? Because at the end of the day, like, literature is great, talking is great, but people are human, and they need contact. They need to see other people. Like spaces like this are invaluable. So, like, it's like, I, like, get very pensive and shaky because, like, this is urgent to me. This is like, oh, then one day we're gonna wake up and then someone's gonna, no, men are not gonna come to their senses. They're in their senses. And this is the final foot of patriarchy. The final foot. They can control, like, how we call ourselves, how we identify ourselves. Now we can't even say our names. So how can we even see each other? This is, like, crazy now. Like, I'm 26. Like, I've been, like, dealing with this shit, like, since I was 20, and I thought it was ridiculous. I was like, oh no, this is just people being silly on the internet. No, but this is, like, shaping literature. Like, people are getting fired and losing jobs. Women are getting killed. Lesbians are getting killed by men for, like, just having a difference in opinion. Like, this is, like, real danger stuff. So, like, I want, like, today, I came here because I want something today, now, that I can do, whatever I can do, I want to be able to do it.
The questioner is also asking for concrete steps to take, particularly in light of the fact that gender identity activists seem to have taken over all the public spaces. It's hard to meet, it's hard to have words to call ourselves, and because of her concern that Black lesbians in particular are masculinized by society, treated that way, and exposed to violence because of their skin color, and is urgently concerned about the situation of herself and other young women like her.
First of all, what's your name?
Emma.
Emma, you're incredible. We should link up after this, for sure. I am so glad you went off, because you're right. This is such an incredibly urgent issue. I mean, I legitimately feel like the reason I transitioned was because I felt all this pressure, I felt all this fear, and I was just said, I will just double down and take it because, like you said, like, early exposure to porn, BDSM culture, kink culture, having that normalized, especially in this third wave of feminism, literally is teaching young women these days, you have to be a masochist. You just have to let the world just, like, beat and, like, tie you down, and it is insane. It is frustrating. And that's feminist, and that you're doing the right thing, and that's somehow helping women, and that's somehow protecting us. But you're right, lesbians are literally being attacked, literally being killed, literally over how we identify ourselves, which is, first of all, no one else's business at the end of the day, but our own. And we can't even have autonomy over our own bodies, over our own spaces, over our conversations with one another without running the risk of losing our professions, losing our friends, losing family even. It's insane, the climate that we live in. The world wasn't like this, like, 10 years ago. I mean, I didn't grow up and think, I wasn't, like, sitting around at, like, 8 years old being like, I wonder how many, like, trans women I'll meet in life or whatever. That just, like, never crossed my mind. I mean, I was thinking about what I want to be. My major in college was game design. I mean, I was thinking about being a woman in STEM, like being a woman, like, in the medical, or not medical, but just in the technology industry. But then all of that went out the window as soon as I was introduced to gender ideology. But people are too scared, I think, for legitimate reasons, to have these conversations and to be open. And I feel like just us being here is at least a good starting point, but there has to be something more. I mean, I just realized that I need to stop being afraid of talking about this, because if I can let this fear continue to rule my life and rule my decisions, then I'm just gonna sit and watch the world turn to absolute shit, and I don't particularly want that. I want women to literally enjoy the victories that we've won in our fights in the last couple decades, and continue to do more and do better for women and for children nonetheless, growing up in such an age where we've never been exposed to this kind of intense advertisement culture, this intense sex culture that is thrown in our faces. Literally, we can download a game on our phone and then all of a sudden just have the most insane ads pop up. I mean, children have iPads. I don't know, we just need to do something. I want to brainstorm with anyone here. If anyone has any ideas of how we can actually encourage women to have the courage to come out and talk to us openly and organize together, that would be incredible, because we've been trying as much as we can so far. I mean, this is the most major thing we've done yet, which is awesome. But people are really afraid online, and I get that. I really do, but
I also think it's important to just refuse to let this shut you up, because that is the absolute worst thing you can do. I mean, this is all about silencing women right now. It's all about silencing lesbians, and you cannot give in. And I know I can't speak for everyone, and that some people are, I understand if professionally it's a risk, you're going to get fired or something like that. I understand that, but for a lot of people, you just have to be public about this online right now. It's really scary and it's really hard, but the more of a stink we make, the harder it's going to be to ignore us. Especially with Megan Murphy. She got banned from Twitter. That was such a gigantic professional networking tool that she used. That was how she spread her information. That was how she met other radical feminists online. And they booted her off Twitter, and look what that did. Now everyone talks about Megan Murphy, and now Megan Murphy is, making her YouTube channel, and she will not shut up. So we have to be like her, and we have to be public about this, and we have to connect with other people, even if they may not be radical feminists necessarily. I know that ever since I've been vocal about this online, yes, I've lost friends. Yes, I've had people call me a Nazi. I've had people call me a TERF. I've had people tell me that I need to go die in a fire. I've had that, but I've also had women come to me and say, thank you for saying something. This is fucking insane. So, and now I have friends who have been scared for the last few months and have been messaging me in private. I have a little group chat with women that I know in real life who are too scared to say anything, but they're getting more pissed off about it. And now they're starting to say stuff publicly online. So it's a journey for everyone, and I know that not everyone can just automatically be open about this, and it's really scary. And I guess for me it's different because it's well, fuck, gender identity ruined my life. What do I have to lose? But other people do have a lot to lose. But I still think that it's really important to connect and be loud in any way that you possibly can. Even if it's hard to do that in real life, you have to settle for online sometimes, and just connect with as many people online as you can, and if you can, start things in the real world. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, just one thing to add to that essentially is just that there's strength in numbers. And I do think it generally has to start online just because of the climate we're in. But I truly do think it's becoming easier to speak out about it just because of us and everyone who is speaking out about it. And that's part of what we're trying to do, is make it easier for other people to join us and to speak out. So yeah, if you can start, creating groups, creating whatever you can online, and then gradually transferring that to the real world. And I mean, in all honesty, I think a lot of these activists, the trans rights activists, they just don't expect us to speak out. They sort of bank on the fact that we're going to shut up and that they can threaten us into silence. And I think we need to understand that we're not going to do that anymore.
One last thing. So I think it's really hard, unfortunately, to talk about women's rights specifically, and it's really hard to talk about detransition specifically. But if we can pick these kind of peak transy topics to talk to other people about, everyone fucking knows that men have a biological advantage over women in sports. That is not debatable. Have you ever interacted with a man? It's just not debatable. So I think if you pick topics like that, or maybe transing of little kids, everyone knows that a 3-year-old cannot know their gender identity. That's utter trash. Everyone has these kind of basic common sense things going on in their heads, and even if there's ideology on top of that, that makes them not be able to break through to common sense on other issues, there are these issues that we can connect with other people about, that are way more likely for them to hear us out and listen to what we have to say. And then once you get someone talking about how men are not equal to women in terms of biological advantage in sports, then you can say, well, then how come they can go in our prisons? You can get people thinking. You can Pique trans them. So I think that's really important.
I don't know whether you want me to say anything, Emma. I mean, I'm obviously not in the situation you're in, or these other women are in at all, because in the 1970s was so different. There was lesbian everything. There was a lesbian disco every night in London. There were women's centres. There were conferences every week or two. And it was pretty safe. I mean, even as a 14-year-old young lesbian, you could go to a lesbian club and lesbians would support you. It was a totally different space. And you are trying to come out at a time that there is nothing, and everywhere that you could potentially go, there are men who are transing, being aggressive and so on. I mean, it's an extraordinarily different situation. And we didn't have the internet, which was spewing forth a lot of toxic bile about who you should be. So it's a very, very different political situation, which means we have to deal with it in a very different way. But obviously, women have to come off the internet and meet. That's absolutely crucial. And in your situation right now, well, you have these women, but they're not in the same town. So I think that we've got to get to the situation where more and more is set up for women. If it's a radical feminist group, a lot of the women might be older, but young women could at least go there and feel safer. And it's a beginning, and then they begin to find others. And in New Zealand, where the Lesbian Rights Alliance was told, after having been booked to be at the Pride event, they could not be there because they were recognised to be TERFs or whatever, they're going to do their own march, right? So things are happening. And that's what women can do. In your city, you can do your own woman-loving, blooming well woman-loving march, right? And everybody can go there, and gradually you'll find other women. It's terrible to have to start from nothing. We didn't start from nothing. I didn't start from nothing. There was all kinds of stuff. And you're having to start from nothing. But yes, go wherever there are radical feminists, get involved in setting up a new march. All of those things have to happen.
I am the mother of a 22-year-old woman who identifies as transgender right now. And she's planning to have surgery in the next few months. And I have a sense of urgency about it, and we have a difficult relationship. We do speak to each other, but I feel silenced, like I really can't speak my mind about it. And I'm wondering what you would say when you look back on your relationships with your mothers, with your families. What advice would you have about the ways that you wish that your relationships could have gone with your parents, or the good things that? Thank you.
The questioner is the mother of a young woman who is planning to have gender recognition surgery in a few months, and she's asked the panel to speak about what they think would be helpful to say, or what they remember that was helpful from their relationships with their families.
Yes.
So I had a really difficult relationship with my mom. We didn't talk for 6 months. We ended up getting in a fight, and she said some words that were really hurtful, and I ended up just blocking her number, and we didn't talk, and all this stuff. And now that I think back on it, I completely understand where she was coming from. At the time, I hated her guts. Like, I hated her. But now I'm so sympathetic, and I feel terrible about what I put her through. But my dad acted very differently. My mom was obviously very panicked, and she was obviously just, I don't know, I'm sure she had all these thoughts going through her head, like, oh my God, is she gonna, get surgery? Is she gonna do all this shit? And she was just having a very hard time keeping it together. But she also didn't really try to talk to me about it. I don't know anything about your relationship with your daughter, but for my mom, she was not handling it the right way. She was kind of treating it as an urgent situation, as opposed to what I probably would have needed was just my mom to kind of come down to my level, even though I was being ridiculous, even though I was being a brat, to just kind of come down to my level and try to understand where I was coming from. And my dad did that in a sort of way. He didn't handle it perfectly, but instead of, like, my mom would begin every conversation we had after I unblocked her with, have you had surgery yet? Are you having surgery? So, and that pissed me off, and that made me feel really, I don't know, not like a human being. Like, just, she didn't want me to have surgery, and that was why she was talking to me. So, but my dad would, I don't know, I said I wanted to be a man, so he took me out to drive a stick shift. And he said that, we could get some beers when I turned 21. And, he said if I ever need a suit for some kind of event, he would take me out to go buy a suit. And I'm sure the whole time he was cringing. But he knew that that's what I wanted, and that was going to be one of the only ways to bond with me. Without, he wanted to, I guess, acknowledge what I was feeling without acknowledging my desire to take these physical medical steps. And every time my mom would kind of bring it up, he would be like, let's not talk about that right now. He would always try to meet me on, a human level, and he would always ask me, what's going on in school? He would never mention the trans stuff. I'm sure he was also really worried. We've talked about it a lot since, and he was really worried. He didn't want me to have the surgery, but I guess he saw that the way that my mom was handling it was not going very well. And eventually, throughout it all, I was always more comfortable talking to my parents, which is very different from when I grew up. Growing up, I always went to my mom, but during this period of my life, I always went to my dad. And I felt so much more able to come to him with my different problems, my different feelings, and my different questions, because I felt like he did not consider my trans identity an urgent pariah upon his life. I'm sure it was, but it's really important to, I think it's really cruel. The cruelty of this situation is that in your most urgent moments, you have to be the calmest that you've ever been. And it's incredibly difficult, and I'm so sorry that you have to go through that. But that would be my advice, to just try to steer conversations to more of a human level, and just try to preserve any part of that bond with your daughter that you can. Even if it's strained, even if your relationship is shit right now, it can get better. It can always get better. Me and my mom hated each other, we fought, and now we don't. And we've learned so much through each other, through this experience. But it is very, very important to just preserve that bond and kind of try to distract her, maybe do activities with her together that are more physical, or just if you're not at that point in a relationship, try to have conversations that are about her interests, and just always ask questions, get her to talk and trust, and that will be the best way to get her to think outside the gender identity, because you don't want her to associate you with an attack on her gender identity. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just want to mention, she's a student at Evergreen College. So, there are lots of miles between us, and also she's in the hotbed of,
oh, Jesus.
Gender identity.
Oh, that is so horrible. Wow.
Get her off campus.
Yeah. That's terrible, especially because it's I'm sure that a lot of what she's going through is very influenced by that community, and that it's not purely coming from within her. I know that a lot of what I was going through was 100% influenced by my community. Leaving college helped a lot. Getting off of Tumblr helped a lot. So anything you can do to make her enjoy parts of life that are outside of that is a win. So, yeah.
the collective perception. In that cult, what is the Achilles heel? What is the chink in the armor, the weakness that would have helped you see that there was a way out? What is it about that cult that if somebody wanted to show you that, look, here's a way out of the maze, how would that be done?
So the question is, it sort of sounds like gender is sort of a cult. What's its weakness? What's the way out? What helps people to see a way out?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I think a lot of it is just strength in numbers. One of the main tenets of a cult is it does isolate you, and it makes you feel very alone, and the only thing you can sort of depend on is the other people who are pushing this ideology on you. So I think it does drive a divide between young people, especially young girls and their mothers and the rest of their families, like the previous question. So I think just, working really hard to foster those relationships and rebuild those relationships, and then also, again, just finding more people who are resistant to it as well is really the main thing you can do to sort of escape from that.
So I definitely think it has a lot of similarities to a cult, at least the part of the community that I was in. And for me, one of the biggest things, when I look back on it, there are a couple things where I remember I would toe the line publicly, but internally in my head I would be like, this is so stupid. And one of those things was the attitude of trans women towards trans men, and how we as trans men have so much privilege, and we need to step aside for trans women because it's so easy to be a trans man. All you have to do is stab a 3-inch needle into your leg. Like, it's so much privilege and all this stuff. And anytime a trans man would try to talk about some kind of very womanly experience, like sexual harassment, sexual assault, the weight of femininity and all this stuff, trans women would always come in and spin it in some way that made it like it was our fault or we were privileged somehow. Like, I know you've told me before about how you had a trans woman friend who would, you would be upset about your menstrual cycle while you were identifying as trans, and he would, interrupt you and guilt you when you were talking about it and tell you that you were lucky for having this menstrual cycle because he didn't have one. And that kind of shit, it just, like, there's only so long that you can sit there and agree with that as a woman. There's only so long that you can subvert your own humanity, if that makes any sense, in favor of trans women. And I think that there is a lot of this attitude that trans men are privileged and trans women are oppressed, and that trans men are just like any other man. And no. So I think that is a really big thing that, for me, was one of the things that made me see past the ideology. And it was one of the very first things, still even while I identified as trans, I was like, what the hell, man? Like, I'm not privileged compared to these trans women. I mean, why are there these trans women CEOs and trans women politicians and trans women blah, 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 and trans men are porn stars? Question mark? So, yeah, I do think that for women, at least, that is the way kind of out of the cult. Because once you see, like, hey, I'm not privileged, they're not more oppressed than me, then you start to think, well, why is that? Is it because I'm female? Well, if I'm oppressed because I'm female, then how am I a man? You have these groundbreaking intellectual conversations with yourself. And so yeah, I think that, as well as just all the other versions of cognitive distortion that make absolutely no sense, just kind of targeting that and always kind of talking about those and making more people understand those so that it eventually reaches those people inside the cult so that they can look around themselves and realize that 90% of the thoughts going on in their head are bullshit.
The only thing I have to add to that is the other little piece of the Achilles heel is just statistics. That led me to detransition really fast because I actually started to just Google. I know this seems like so mind-blowing, but just actually Googling half of the statistics that the trans community likes to throw around is like absolute fact. Like, for instance, it's pretty common in the rhetoric for them to say that black trans women, especially black trans women sex workers, which is their favorite thing to talk about on earth, when really by sex work they just mean these like teenagers who end up camming online. Anyway, they're like, these are the most oppressed people on earth, but it's like, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of oppression on earth. So, yeah, and then also there's like this, there's also these statistics like 27 trans women were murdered this year. And then you're like, well, hundreds of thousands of women were victims of domestic violence in the last week. Like, okay, 27, all right. So it's just legitimately opening yourself to understanding statistics as they actually are and not as they're like told to you in just this regurgitated rhetoric that gets spread around all the time.
Another big statistic, like some of the main things that I was kind of like, whoa, wait a second, I've been lied to. The statistic is 40% of trans women are murdered. And that's the one that they love to throw around all the time. And it's like, okay, well, if that was true, then why the hell are there so many trans women? But that statistic is actually not in reference to trans women in general. It's in reference to prostituted transvestites in Brazil. So once you understand that, sorry?
I was saying, and also, what about the women prostitutes there? What if
Exactly. Thank you. So that's a big one that I was like, hold on, wait a second. What is the goal of faking this statistic? If it's not true, why have I believed this for 5 years if it's not true? Why are people so interested in spreading this lie? It's kind of obvious, it's just indoctrination, blah, blah, blah. Another one is Marsha P. Johnson. You know, Marsha P. Johnson threw the first brick at Stonewall, she gave you your rights. Yeah, well, Marsha P. Johnson, 10 days before his death, said he was a gay man who liked to cross-dress. And when I learned about that, that was insane to me because I used to be one of those people who was like, Marsha P. Johnson gave you your rights, cisbians. So just spreading the truth about those kinds of things is so important because so many people are literally just unaware. And if you just tell people Marsha P. Johnson was a gay man and didn't even show up at Stonewall until like a couple hours into it, then it's kind of hard. You have to question everything else, and then that will eventually lead the whole thing to unravel. So.
What's kind of amazed me about that whole stealing of Stonewall history is it's like you're taking Marsha P. Johnson away from gay men's. You're like stealing gay men's history. And then you're stealing black lesbian history because Stormy DeLarverie, I'm probably mangling her name and I'm sorry, but like she started this Stonewall fight. And so you're stealing an important part of black lesbian history. You're stealing that from women and turning it into something that it's really not. And it's incredible, now every time that anniversary comes around, how many major organizations that should have like researchers on staff, and they should have like at least one person on the payroll and their staff of hundreds who's picked up a history book or read this and knows what happened, who could fact check this.
This is what is being said right now in New York Public Library in the Stonewall exhibition. The leaflet that goes with it says that Stonewall was created by transgenders.
Oh, no.
It says that. Now that's gone down in history, it's fact, it's at the public library where people expect to get proper information. So I do think there should be a petition, lots of letters of complaint, and something should be done about this. It is blooming shocking, absolutely shocking. That's how far we've gone down this rabbit hole.
Which library? New York. The main one on 42nd? Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, hello. I wanted first to thank you, all of you up there, and especially the young
women who have shared their stories. I come from Colombia, and I just wanted to connect this gender ideology and how it's really, how we have had to work on it from countries that are from the global south. We're not exactly living what you're living here. And this is a specific question for Sheila, because we have had, I'm an anthropologist, and we use the category of gender as an analysis category of power relationships, basically. And the idea was to open space for diversity to be recognized and for special programs, et cetera, to be taken by authorities and governments, et cetera, in our countries. However, what has happened, when you're in 50 years in war, as we were, we don't have movements. We didn't have a feminist movement. I mean, women were killed, basically, if they pronounced themselves feminists. So we used the word gender, like a more neutral kind of...
A euphemism. It's a euphemism.
What?
It's a euphemism.
It's a new?
A euphemism.
Yes, exactly. So we used it as a way to open that space for equality between, we were looking for equality measures. What has happened with this is that even our peace process, which was put into, it was put in a plebiscite, I don't know how you call that, referendum 2 years ago. I have to ask a society if they want peace or not. That's ridiculous, but they did it. The president did it. And we got a majority of no. Incredibly enough, you know why? Because they used the gender ideology issue against all the peace promoters. So peace promoters, people like us who wanted peace, people who want diversity, indigenous people to be recognized, their rights to land, women's rights, etc., LGBT, etc. As we don't have it as a huge movement like you've had in here, but we need to recognize our country is a diversity. It all came back at us, and they said, okay, this is an ideology, and really you want to take over the whole nation, and you want to take over territories that are really from the nation, etc., etc., etc. So we've gone back, 20 years, we've gone back into, we're in conflict, we've gone back in our politics, really to a conservative kind of environment. And so the question is how, because now I work against sexual exploitation and prostitution in Colombia, and the difficulty is that we are having this, we are trying to say gender ideology, there's no such thing as gender ideology, because they're saying gender ideology is anybody who thinks differently. And this is how they're using it in our countries. You are gender ideology if you think different to the statu quo and how things should be. Okay, so it's different than what's happening here. Okay, but at the same time, we're getting super funding from Soros and the OSF, etc., to gay men and trans men to go pro-prostitution, right? And to say sex work is work. And so Colombia is a perfect place because you've had 50 years of women being sexually abused and used in war. You've got forced displacement. You've got all the women from Venezuela coming in right in. And it's a perfect place. And you have entitled men, right? Because they come from war, 2 women's bodies. So it's a perfect place for the sex industry and pornography industry. So we are fighting really big issues. And now the thing is, do we use the gender ideology thing? We don't. If we classify ourselves as, I didn't even know I was a radical feminist, and somebody started to, you're a radical feminist. I didn't know. Okay, we don't have these discussions in Colombia.
Welcome.
We discuss human rights issues, okay? And this is, I come from the human rights world in Colombia, and great human rights violations, assassinations, kidnappings, forced displacement, forced disappearance, etc., torture. And that's what takes me to sexual exploitation, because sexual exploitation and prostitution are all the human rights abuses that you can imagine. They're all there, systematic and generalized. So how do we manage this? Because you were saying, yes, there is this gender ideology. This would really, if these people who are using this, the conservatives in Colombia and in all of Latin America, because this is happening all over Latin America, heard you say, yes, there's an ideology, then they're going to say, you're right. I mean, all what we social scientists worked for when we put out this category of analysis to show power unbalance, it has gone back against us, basically, no? So, what to do? There it goes.
The questioner is an anthropologist from Colombia and is talking about how after so many years of civil war and strife, when it was deadly to be called a feminist, that they developed their analysis under the category of gender to use it to have as an alternate term. And now conservatives across Latin America and the Global South are using the current form of gender ideology as it's being used in Western countries, in the Global North, I guess, against them, and like push down Colombia's peace referendum. And now things are going back, and the current state of gender activism is being used to promote the sex industry and prostitution as NGO money comes in from outside to fund gay men and trans-identified men to support sex industry activism, pushing down women's activism against the sex industry. So what to do?
There's actually quite a lot in there. Can I just say before I begin that I've been invited by a man and a woman at some university in Colombia to come because they're doing a project on prostitution. I was invited once before and I never went because it was a long way from Australia. This time I will go, so can we be in touch, please? Yes. Okay, so that's really important because I'd like a friend. But the problem with language, yes, as radical feminists, we didn't use that language of gender. I never did. I talked about sex. I talked about sex roles, not gender roles. I tried never to use that language. It was adopted by what we saw as the socialist feminists and liberal feminists, really, who were in international development anthropology. They took on this word. I'm horrified they did, because actually it was very complicated to understand. They said gender means the system of power relations between the sexes. Nobody understood that. It was very complex, very ethereal but nobody understood that. What they understood is gender is the same as sex, and that's the way that it's gone. So unfortunately, it was very much a mistake to use that language of gender, and now we've got a heap of trouble. I had a PhD student do a PhD with me on gender training of peacekeepers, because she wanted to show not only it doesn't work and it's, that nobody's really interested in supporting it, but also that in most languages in the world the word gender doesn't exist. Nobody knows what anybody is talking about, but it's definitely adopted as a euphemism, because you can't talk about male violence, you can't talk about violence against women. You have to use a term nobody understands, most languages don't understand, and nobody could give her a definition of gender. And she interviewed all these peacekeepers all over the place. So we've been put down the rabbit hole by the term gender, and we've got to fight our way out, try and find our way back to the surface where we can talk about women and male violence and all those sort of things. But the other problem, and there is another problem, is prostitution and transgenderism, transvestism in the Global South and here in New York. The anthropologist, the gay anthropologist David Valentine, who I talk about at the beginning of my book, Gender Hurts, in 1997, he's written a book, and he was working for an AIDS charity in New York, and he was told by this AIDS charity he should go to the area of the Stroll where men were involved in prostitution and wearing women's clothes, gay men. And he was told they were transgender. He must go and talk to the transgender community. Where are they in prostitution in that bit of New York, right? So he went there and discovered none of them thought they were transgender. They'd never heard the term. They were ordinary gay men. They wanted to keep their penises, thank you. So at that point, in 1997, this term had not been, through American cultural imperialism and various aid agencies and billionaires, actually sent all around the world to encompass what are actually men in prostitution, who actually help, not celebration, as transgenders. So the problem is all the different varieties, or there really is very similar, of men in prostitution, like the hitras in India, where boys are taken in to be in pimps' houses, and they're now being told that they are transgender. They're certainly not. They're certainly not. Thai lady boys are being said to be transgender. Fa'afafine in the South Pacific are said to be transgender. There are a lot of problems involved in the prostitution of these men, very serious problems and very serious violence. But of course the aid agencies have got this language of transgender, which they're transferring out through American cultural imperialism to these countries and saying it's absolutely fine, they're transgender and we're going to support them as transgender. So what they don't tend to have, they do in South America, but in many other countries they don't have, is autogynephiles. I know they do in many places in South America, which is the heterosexual men who are cross-dressing. What they do have is often boys and young men who are wearing women's clothes in order to survive in prostitution, because the whole point of it is that the men using them like to think they're still macho and heterosexual by using some young lad who's wearing a dress and they can, perform this extraordinary act of lying to themselves in the head. So yes, I'm sorry that there's an awful lot in what you asked me there, and we can't really go into it this evening, but I hope we will talk anon.
So I come from Norway, which has the most so-called liberal law, which means you can go into the internet and change your biological sex and get absolutely every right as a woman if you're a man. We have something interesting. Can I come with a comment more than a question? In Norway, something is happening very positively. And the reason why it is happening is, I think, one of the Achilles heel of the trans activists. In Norway, at least, that Achilles heel seems to be the connection between sex work and pro-prostitution interests and the trans activists. The women's movement in Norway is still quite strong. This 8th of March, there were 20,000 people in Oslo marching, and we managed for the second time on the 8th of March to vote down their slogan, which was trans people's and sex workers' rights equals feminism. They started with that last year, and this was a slogan which was internationally organized. It was in all English-speaking countries that I know of. But anyway, I was wondering, at least in Norway, I think that is one place we can argue, and we will get some support. But the other thing is to understand some of the political backgrounds for why gender has been used as a political tool to, in a way, destroy feminism, you could say. So if you haven't read the Yogai Karta principles from 2006, I really, really would like you to read them, because that is the political, really, platform of how to change all these laws around the world. The Yogai Karta principles from 2006.
Which are being
I know you know
in this
them.
room. In
Huh?
this room. There's a meeting on that tonight in this room.
Yeah, I'm coming. But not all these people are coming.
Commenter is from Norway and was talking about how one Achilles heel that they have found is the convergence and connection of trans issues with the sex industry, and that they tried to push a slogan, trans women and sex workers' rights.
Trans rights and sex workers' rights equals feminism.
Trans rights and sex workers' rights equals feminism, and that's gotten a lot of pushback there. And she also brought up the Yogai Karta principles, which, as Sheila said, we're going to be discussing in a few hours, right here in this room.
How do you spell it?
How do you spell Yoga Karta?
Yogyarta. Yeah.
Yoga and art. It's a
Place in India.
No.
Indonesia, yeah, right.
Question?
Yes. For those of us who may have young women in our lives, like teenagers, 12-year-olds, who are at risk from this gender code, that they may be budding lesbians and that are being. Are there any resources or any online anything that you can give us to, if we know the mothers, to help them, get some other viewpoints?
Pique Yogurt. Pique Yogurt's great videos.
And these ladies right here.
Yeah, no. Do you have things online? I mean, I think hearing from you and from, women like you who detransitioned, or, young women that are maybe a little older than them, and it would be very valuable.
Question was, those of us who know young women who are at risk from gender identity ideology, especially young lesbians, what resources exist online? Another member of the audience had also brought up the peach yogurt videos. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Pique is amazing. You should definitely check out her videos. You should be able to find her on YouTube fairly easily. I think just general female and lesbian positivity in general, I couldn't necessarily name like something off the top of my head at the moment, but if you search that, you have to dig a little bit, unfortunately, but you should be able to find that.
How do you spell it? Peach yogurt.
It's peach and then like the fruit. I think yogurt like with an H in there. I think.
She's anonymous, so that's just her handle.
Get yogurt like a thing you eat?
Yes.
Yeah, all one word. Again, you have to check her out.
She's a lesbian also.
For sure. One resource for parents and possibly for you, like relatives of young trans-identified kids, is the website Fourth Wave Now. Are you familiar? My mother actually started that.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I passed that along. That was the one thing yeah, I haven't read everything on there, but it's more from the parents' viewpoint than the young people.
Yeah, that was just a suggestion, like for support for people like you and parents, for sure.
That's great.
Absolutely. Check that out for sure. Gender Trender is another one that comes to mind. If you guys very similar. Gender Trending.
Oh, really?
It's back. It just came back. Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
So awesome. All right.
Yeah, gender trending now.
And then quickly, our channel / presence online, we're the Pique Resilience Project. It's Pique as in Pique, Resilience Project. We make YouTube videos, we also have a podcast, and we also just do various writings and stuff like that online. And I think for parents, it's really useful because we do sometimes give advice for parents, but Fourth Wave Now and Gender Trender and all that stuff, that's really good for parents as well. But I think specifically for young teenagers who may not be involved in the trans stuff yet, but are susceptible to it, it's really important to know that detransition exists, because the way that it's portrayed to these kids is that this is the Enlightenment. Like, gender ideology is it. There is no other answer, there's no after, there's no detransitioners. That's extremely rare. So I think younger kids need to know, like, before they even get in contact with gender ideology or before they start considering it seriously, that there are people out there who've been hurt by it and that there is another narrative to consider. So, because then it won't seem like this panacea of knowledge. So, yeah.
May I make a suggestion really quick for that? Because this is excellent. Charlie Gray. She's a young woman. She spells R-A-E. She's done two and I think a few extra other videos. I think she writes for the Fifth Column. Something like that.
Charlie Ray,
R-A-E. R-A-E. And she's young. She's a wonderful communicator. They're great videos. And she just does one of the videos is really just an overview of the many heads of the monster that is gender ideology, and others very specifically why gender ideology is homophobic. And she's wonderful. My daughter, she'd seen me watching Peachy Yogurts, and she's like, that I put, and the reason is that she's very goofy and she's fun and she's wonderful, but my daughter really thinks she's hip. Charlie is young and hip and a great communicator, and I think you'll really like her.
Myself? I've been in touch with a number of women who are gender critical for a number of years, and some of us who are left-leaning and who are also disturbed by the fact that there are so much gender critical stuff, some of which is good, is in, the Federalist and, all these publications that want to take away official app, such as it is, seems to run afoot in sync with the gender ideology. So I want to first of all announce that a new group has just been born, starting on International Women's Day. It was launched, and it's a national group. It's right now women are communicating by the internet and through phone calls, but we're hoping to have a conference with as soon as we can. And it's called FIST, F-I-S-T, which stands for Feminists in Struggle. And I don't know right now, it's got all the parts. It's got the website and donate button and a mission statement. The most important thing is a mission statement that was struggled over for months. And it's finally kind of ready to go. So I think you can Google it. If you can't, however, come over to me, give me your email address if you'll trust me with that, and I will send you a link. One of the ways that the group wants to work is to form affiliates in different regions of women who can face-to-face, community affiliates of FIST. So there definitely are women in the New York area who are leading various groups. It was mentioned before, Meetup, right? Feminist Meetup, etc. So, and there was another group that had been meeting that sort of, anyway, we can form something in New York. I'm sure women are interested. So see me about this. The question I actually wanted to ask is, I agree that we have to shift the culture. I agree that we have to, in a way, start in the scenes that we're in, start talking to people, etc. In my attempts to do that, I keep running into fierce and impassioned defense of trans women who are seen as under attack by feminists, who I think of often as liberal feminists. Some are socialist feminists. They span a whole range of all those labels. And some of them, I ran into an artist at a party last night who was like, this is typical. I have very good friends who are trans women, and they really go through a lot. And there's this personal identification and this, the compassion, the sympathy. I won't betray my friends. I won't, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess my question is about how do you break that down? Where do you begin when someone is coming at you with this kind of impassioned, empathy-based, fierceness, which you can't argue it directly, but where do you make a dent? Do you run into it? And also, what do you think the psychology of that is? That women, heterosexual, bisexual, lesbian, across the board, are walking around with this and feeling it's part of their mission of justice in life to defend how do you speak in your personal life to these women?
So several folks have mentioned additional resources which may not have made it onto the recordings. So Charlie Ray, the last name is spelled R-A-E, as a resource for commentary. She identified as trans for a while.
She has videos on YouTube also.
And she's on YouTube and writes at the Fifth Column. Gender Trender, which, as we all famously know, was shut down by WordPress, has come back up just this week as Gender Trending. Hopefully all the historic posts will go back up, because I still find tabs open in my browser that were open to an old Gender Trender article, and now it just has that sad WordPress takedown message. And it's just like, oh. Anyway, and then also a new group, Feminists in Struggle, has started for women who are trying to create space in more left-leaning political circles and venues. The question was about how often, and I've certainly run into this too, women in liberal spaces who feel that trans women are the people who are under the most attack. They perceive them as the people that they have to defend, and say, these are my friends, and what you're saying is hurtful to them, and where do you go from that conversation? Because it does just seem to be a wall that people put up, how can you say that about my friend? And then it's over, your conversation's done. Where do you go?
I'm a lesbian separatist, have been for a very, very long time, so I don't have the problem of sort of being with women whose friends are men as a general rule. That's not my community. So I don't have quite the same problems that you're having. as I understand it, it's because these women want to be nice to these men. I mean, women are trained to be nice to men from the moment that they are born. They're trained to dote upon men, try to make them feel comfortable. The idea of making them feel sad, and transgender activists often threaten to cry, and that's just horrifying. Women cannot bear to see a man potentially unhappy. Also, they're often 6'6" and quite frightening. But apart from that little difficulty, women want to serve these men. And I don't know how we stop that. You know, we need proper radical feminism, which means that women actually stop serving men and refuse to do so. So I think that's actually what underlies all of this, women's huge sympathy. And the other argument that I hear women such as you're talking of often make is, oh yes, these transgender activists at the moment can be very aggressive and they're spoiling things for the real transsexuals. Yeah. There are real transsexuals out there who are probably 65, who've been in there a long time and are really very nice, and you don't even notice them in the ladies. And they're ones who've just got a problem, that's a really serious problem for them of gender dysphoria, which doesn't exist. But we need to be really, really nice to them, as well as having a little difficulty with the ones who are punching women, doing terrible protests, death threats, etc., who are a different constituency altogether. The problem is they're not a different constituency. So the defense of the older transsexuals makes it very difficult, who are the ones who need the sympathy, to actually deal with transgenderism, which is a problem, which is actually a sexual problem. Some of the older ones say, oh, it's not about sex, I'm not interested in sex now. But the writings on this by the sexologists and men who are transgender themselves, who are a bit critical, do say that it starts at 11, you know, they'll be masturbating to women's clothes at 11. When puberty breaks, by the time they've been doing all this stuff for about 30 years, some of them actually feel they're no longer so interested in sex, but they are really women. I mean, really women means getting sexually excited by women's knickers, mind you. It's a kind of odd idea about women. But some of them say it's not about sex now, and they appear to be sort of harmless when they're 65. But the problem is we have to have an analysis which covers everything. And at the moment this is very, very hard to do without appearing to be nasty, and women mustn't be nasty.
So I think my response to how to deal with the women in your life who do end up just completely serving these men is to get them to a point where they realize they need to prioritize themselves. Because the second they realize that they're not prioritizing their needs as a woman because they're trying to meet the needs of a man who thinks he's a woman because he has hard feelings or something, as in comparison to your lifelong experience of multitudes or oppression in like a multitude of forms, and all the discrimination, all of the bullying, all of the pain you've gone through, and then you compare your youth, your childhood to essentially what Sheila just said, a childhood where like this is a male child who grows up in a heavily pornographic culture that like that man has cultivated for himself or his peers have helped cultivate for him, and then that has led to the development of some absurd mental idea that he experiences anything remotely close to you. I think just breaking it down to you have two completely different lives. And regardless of how much, I mean, you can care for your friend. You can care for a friend who's in distress. You can care for a friend who has suicidal ideation or has mental illness problems. I mean, but that's different than selling your entire existence as a female person in order to alleviate someone else's pain or alleviate their trauma, because it's essentially just men putting the weight of their pain and trauma on women. And I just feel like it's completely unproductive. And I also feel like it's really important to say that if your relationship to a trans-identified person who's your friend is contingent on you accepting their identity, opposed to your shared interests or your mutual values or what you guys like to do together, then they're not really your friend. I mean, they're just using you as a way to bolster their confidence or their absurd sense of self, like their inflated sense of self. And I feel like it's really important to just break that down and realize that you have to prioritize and have respect for yourself first and foremost before you can have any positive or respectful relationship with anyone else.
Well said.
I also think it's important to realize that when those women will preach to you about how hard it is for trans women, they're not necessarily coming from a genuine place. I mean, as I said before, I used to be a big trans activist, and I used to be all about how trans men are privileged over trans women, but it was all kind of like virtue signaling. And I remember one of the moments that kind of got me thinking was, I was on Tumblr and I made some Tumblr posts and I said, you know, oh, black trans women of color are so oppressed, blah, blah, blah. And then I got a message on Tumblr that was like, how dare you speak for black trans women? You're a privileged white man. And I was like, and then from that point on, I was like, every time I saw someone say all this shit about black trans women, I just thought back to that experience of like, okay, so I was just called a privileged white man. But how are those trans women not privileged white men? Like, it just really got me thinking. So it just, you need to have a little bit of self-esteem, and I think that I think that the trans movement kind of preys on the fact that a lot of women don't have that self-esteem. They might have it in other areas, but we all, like Sheila said, have this just learned reaction to prioritize others, but especially men, over ourselves. And if you can kind of get women thinking about what they're actually saying when they talk about how privileged they are over trans women, or how hard it is to be a trans woman, like just to think back to your childhood. I mean, have you ever been 12 years old and some dude on the street catcalls you? Is it because your gender identity aligns with what you were assigned at birth, or is it because you have a female body? It's not difficult. And when you get women to kind of think about that and think about the reality, then they're more likely to get in touch with the logical part of themselves that they're repressing when they talk about how hard it is to be a trans woman. So if you kind of dance around the whole trans topic and just talk about your mutual shared experiences of being a woman, then they will realize that nobody who grew up male masturbating to trans porn knows what it's like to be a woman, and it is not fucking harder for them to be a woman than it is to be an actual real-life woman. What is hard for them? If you can't define woman as biology, then what do you define it as? And is it harder to be a man who wears pink than it is to be a literal woman? This is basic stuff that every woman knows in the back of her head. And I think if you can dance around the trans stuff, you can reach that mutual shared anger.
There's another question I want to get to.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I actually am aware of this analysis, which is very good. But some of the women that I'm also talking about, maybe I wasn't clear about, are women who are very fierce feminists in certain areas. Women who spend their lives on the forefront of fighting right on abortion rights, etc. And these are the women that concern me the most. And this is what creates the social pressure not to speak out, because you will be, thrown out of, the sisterhood of very active feminists. And I also say this to somebody who is in the media and cannot have many, many guests who are important, who are doing important things. So I'd like to have as guests on shows that I bring people onto because of this difference on the transition. So I'm not talking just about women who are not identified as women. I'm talking about very sophisticated people who have adopted this, traininess, whatever. But that's also a great concern, because we have to start to make those great decisions.
So the comment was about how the women that the previous same questioner is talking about, how a lot of the women who defend these men most fiercely are themselves feminist activists, have been in that fight for a long time, very fierce advocates for women otherwise. And I think
maybe I'm a good person to respond to this, just because I was fired from a job as a feminist for opposing the idea that there could be such a thing as male lesbians. And I was just like, you know, I'm bi and I'm not a lesbian, but the idea that there are male lesbians is just like, no, I'm sorry, you can't have that. That's like, that has to be for women. And the hardest pushback I got was from women who not only call themselves feminists, but have like thrown their whole career into feminist politics. And the reason why, in my opinion, that happens and that's true is because, I mean, these men have sort of taken over all of the formal feminist spaces. They have taken over the funding streams, the foundations. When I released the article that I wrote, the essay that I wrote right after the last Mishfest, talking about how there's no such thing as male lesbians, and why do we even have to say this? It was incredible, the pushback from all these professional feminists, but my boss said that, you know, she'd been getting just tons of calls that threatened, quote, the ability of the organization to continue. Like, major funders were pushing back, obviously, and it was my impression, you know, maybe people who are otherwise influential, people who linked to the organization, otherwise promoted their work. I mean, it's because they will get fired. It's because they will get excommunicated from their spaces. It's because everything that is on the left that's been taken up, that's like formal LGBT or feminist activism, you cannot work in those places and believe that there's no such thing as a male lesbian. And that's why. And this has been communicated in a wide variety of ways to people, and everybody knows. So, time? Okay. All right, so I'm getting the notice. We gotta wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been wonderful. One last brief comment? Okay.
First, I just want to thank all of you so much. Thank you, Sheila. You really have the project going so great and awesome, and your story is powerful. One thing I was thinking about was just like, you know, this notion of like, we don't really just want to be on the internet, we want to meet in person, but also the internet is like the only space right now we have, our platform we have to reach people in real life. And I'm wondering, like, I just had this idea about like a resource list or like online place for teens or people who are detransitioning, like for mental health resources or things like that. I'm wondering, like, there are any mental health counselors who are out of a feminist in this room who might want to be on some sort of like referral list like that. That was just one idea. But then also, Wolf is having a festival in Northern California this summer. It's on July 5th to the 9th. Tickets are available online at wolffest.org. But I also have flyers here. Come grab one for me. It's a great space to just kind of network and organize and build in a real person in your life. And also, I'm coordinating a Women of Color track and space. So if you want to know more about that, or you're interested in presenting, please reach out to me.
Condra was pointing out that Wolf is going to be having a festival this July 5th through 9th, and there will be a Woman of Color track of programming that she'll be organizing, and anyone who's here can go and get some more information. Would you like me to share your name in the room? Ileana. So go and say hi to Ileana if you want info about Wolf Fest, and I'll be there this summer. Hope to see you all, and thank you everybody for coming. This is
Sorry.
yesterday of gender.